Good afternoon, everyone. My name's Peter Carr, and it's a pleasure for me to be here today to brief you about some of the terrestrial aspects of the British Indian Ocean Territory, also called the Chagos Archipelago. So what I'll be talking to you about today is, first of all, I'll just very briefly introduce myself. I will then explain where BIOT, the British Indian Ocean Territory, is. I do several of these presentations, and about 95% of the audience have never heard of the Chagos Archipelago, and 99% certainly don't know where it is. I'll then cover briefly the terrestrial ecology of BIOT and mention some of the iconic species out there. There'll then be a little twist in the tale, and I'll explain to you why it's actually only half of paradise and not the true paradise it could be. And I'll finish off quickly with a brief explanation of how we can regain paradise, and there will be questions at the end. So first of all, about myself, I first visited the military facility on Diego Garcia in 1996 as a Royal Marine Commando, and I absolutely fell in love with the place. And 10 years later, I managed to get myself posted as the executive officer on Diego Garcia. And I did that job for about 2 to 2.5 years. I then retired from the Royal Marine Commandos after 33 years. And I went back to Diego Garcia for another 2.5 years, working as the environmental director for the base contractor out there. I think I'm the only person in the world to have stepped on and conducted surveys of all 55 islands in the archipelago. If you have a look over this side, I'm also the author of The Birds of the Chagos Archipelago. And since leaving the Royal Marines, I've conducted a Master's by Research and a PhD into seabirds and how they use the marine protected area. Okay, so where is BIOT? Let's start on the left-hand side of this presentation here. And where that red dot is, literally slap bang in the middle of the Indian Ocean, apologies for that, literally slap bang in the middle of the Indian Ocean here is the Chagos Archipelago. It's a part of a line of islands that run down, or actually it's running up. The Chagos is the newest, then you have the Maldives, the Laccadives, and then you have something called the Deccan Traps up there in India. And they're all part formed by tectonic plates moving over a volcano, same as Hawaii. If you have a look at this right-hand side of this slide, this is the archipelago itself. It's made up of 5 islanded atolls and numerous reefs and banks. Starting at the top here, this is the largest atoll. It's Peros Panos. That's about 33 kilometers across. We then have the Solomon Islands, much loved by the yachting community, a beautiful little atoll that one is. This great big feature here is the Great Chagos Bank. It's the largest submerged atoll in the world. Here we have the Egmont Islands Atoll, used to be called the 6 Islands. They've now joined together, and there's only 2 islands there now. And then right down here in the south, this is Diego Garcia, and that's where the military facility is. And that's where there's a transient human population all associated with the military facility. And in the center, these 2 pictures are of a typical coralline island that you find on these atolls. And these are all about 1 to 3 meters above sea level. Okay, so the British Indian Ocean Territory, the atolls of the British Indian Ocean Territory are similar to atolls all around the tropics, and they have a very impoverished terrestrial flora and fauna. And in the case of BIOT, that's probably because they're very young. The islands are only about 6,000 years old, and they are very, very remote. So we've only found 12 native species of tree so far. If you walk around an English park, you'll probably see 25 species of tree. There's less than 50 native higher plants, no native mammals, and there's no small birds. There's no finches or thrushes or anything like that. And to date, there's only been some 125 species of birds seen in the archipelago. On a good couple of days birding in southeast Kent, where I live, I can probably pick up 125 species in 2 days. However, what is there is very important globally and regionally. After some 20 years of doing ornithological surveys out there, I think there's about 1 million individual seabirds. So that's about 280,000 pairs of 18 species of seabirds. And 6 of those species breed in regional or globally significant numbers. There's also 2 significant breeding populations of marine turtles, hawksbill and green. And there is the highest density that's ever been found of robber crabs, also known as coconut crabs, per hectare of any islands surveyed in the world today. And if you have a look at this over here, this is me doing some research on these incredible beasts that can weigh up to 5 kilos. So there are several degrees of protection employed for nature in the British Indian Ocean Territory. The first one is, if you have a look at this blue outline here, this is the Chagos Marine Protected Area. In 2010, when it was declared, it was the largest strict no-take marine protected reserve in the world at about 655,000 square kilometres. Down on Diego Garcia here on the eastern arm of this horseshoe-shaped island, there's a Ramsar site, and that Ramsar site is there because of breeding turtles and breeding seabirds. There's one marine important bird and biodiversity area, and we discovered this marine hotspot through the tracking of seabirds. That's the 11th largest marine IBA, important bird and biodiversity area, in the world. There are 4 terrestrial important bird and biodiversity areas, and they're in place because of those 6 regionally and internationally significant populations of breeding seabirds. And there's a number of strict nature reserves throughout the entire archipelago. Okay, just a little bit of science, and I'll keep this brief. But from research conducted in the archipelago, what we found is these are seabird islands. This is where seabirds breed. And what they do is they go out daily, out into the deep blue, fish, and then come back to the islands in the evenings, or some of these birds stay out for a couple of days at a time, and they defecate. And it's obvious that that happens because we've been mining guano around the world for centuries now. But what we've proven in the Chagos archipelago, that in the tropical rains, this guano runs off into the surrounding oceans. And what we've proven is that fish grow bigger and faster, and coral reefs are more resilient to global stresses such as sea temperatures rising around islands that have seabirds on. I think that actually is pretty obvious if you think about it, because there's fertilizer going in. But that's been proven now, and that sparked a wave of environmental campaigns now to bring back seabird islands. And just to go a little bit further into that, I called this part of this talk Half of Paradise, and I've plagiarized a book by David Bellamy. Some of you may be old enough to remember David Bellamy. He was actually a botanist, but in the 1970s, he did 2 joint service expeditions to the Chagos archipelago, and he coined this phrase for the Chagos Half of Paradise. And why he said that is because he found that 6% of the total landmass, which in essence is, or in reality, is 11 tiny islands, accounted for 94% of all of the breeding seabirds. And why is that? Well, over here, this is the 2 reasons why. When man first colonized not only the Chagos archipelago, but also tropical archipelagos in the Pacific as well as the Indian Ocean. He cut down most of the native hardwood forest that was there and replanted it with coconut. And now in all over the tropics, in the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, many of these coconut plantations are abandoned. And what's happened is all these fronds and nuts have fallen on the floor. And we've coined an expression for this called coconut chaos. And also the architecture of coconut trees is such that seabirds can't breed on them. These big seabirds like tropic birds and boobies need trees that have big limbs like oak trees to breed on. So coconuts, no good for breeding seabirds. But the double whammy is that when man colonized these islands, he brought with him, deliberately in some cases, predators like dogs and cats, and accidentally he introduced rats. And in the Chagos archipelago, these are black rats, and rats and seabirds absolutely do not get on. They devastate seabird colonies. So just to reiterate that point again, 55 islands, but only 2.5 kilometers squared, 11 tiny islands have breeding seabirds in them. So what can we do about that? Well, in 2019, the BIOT administration, the governing authority of the British Indian Ocean Territory, requested the Chagos Conservation Trust, who I work for, to put together a plan to rewild these islands. And in partnership with the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, the Zoological Society of London, and essentially the Bertarelli Foundation, we've been working on this for about 6-7 years now. And the first thing that we were asked to do is produce a robust science case for this rewilding. Well, I'll take you back to that slide that I showed about the good things that seabird islands bring, not just nutrients to the islands, but nutrient transfers into the oceans around. So that's just one reason why we should bring back these seabird islands, why we should rewild these islands. So the robust case, most of it paid for by the Bertarelli Foundation. The Bertarelli program in marine science has funded much of the science out there for the last 10 minutes. And then we were asked to produce feasibility studies, ecological impact assessments, and operational plans for both eradicating rats from the 4 northern atolls and for converting the abandoned coconut plantations back to native habitat or habitat conducive to breeding seabirds. All of those documents have been produced. They've all been peer reviewed, and the plans are ready to go. And we did a pilot project in 2014 on a small 15-hectare island called Vash Marine in southern Peros Panos. And we've proved that we can go out there, we can eradicate rats and convert these old abandoned plantations back to native habitat. And where we stand today in 2025, we have a funding bid in with the Darwin program, asking for money to eradicate rats from 4 larger islands in northeast Peros Panos. And if we receive the funding, and when we're successful with that eradication and habitat conversion, we will produce the longest chain of predator-free islands in the Indian Ocean. Can you imagine that? So that concludes my very brief introduction to the Chagos archipelago. Fingers crossed that the funding comes from Darwin and we can do this eradication and rewilding. But obviously, as you're all aware, there are bigger issues surrounding the British Indian Ocean Territory that may impact our funding application. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my talk, and I will be here for questions on completion of Mark Spalding's talk. Thank you very much.